I sat in the lawyer's office, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and dusted mahogany. The ceiling fan turned slowly, humming like it too was weary of the whole affair. David had been gone for 6 weeks. I still caught myself setting 2 plates at breakfast, still woke in the dark reaching for him. The lawyer, a thin man with trembling hands, cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, Miss Carter, thank you for coming. Emily sat across from me, immaculate as always, navy dress, pearl earrings, not a hair out of place. She didn't look at me. Her expression was one I'd seen before. The polite patience of someone waiting for an elevator. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began to read. To my daughter, Emily Carter, I leave the house on Oak Avenue and $7 million. To my wife, Helen Carter, the cabin on Lake Langston. For a moment, the room was silent except for the slow whir of the fan. I thought I'd misheard him. Excuse me. My voice cracked. The cabin. Emily's lips curved. Not quite a smile, not quite pity. Just control. When the meeting ended, I stood numbly, my hand still gripping the wheel as though the paper might dissolve if I let go. Outside, the sky hung low and gray over Savannah. The air smelled faintly of rain and magnolia. Emily turned to me, her voice smooth, almost kind. Dad just wanted everyone to start over, Mom. Start over. As if 28 years of marriage could be folded and packed away like a winter coat. As if the man who once held my trembling hands at our wedding had now chosen to leave me a piece of wood and dust by a forgotten lake. I looked into her eyes and realized she wasn't my little girl anymore. She was a stranger, and I was standing at the edge of a life that no longer belonged to me. Quick question before we dive in. Where are you watching from? Hit like if you've ever had to find your voice in your own family. The call came on a quiet Thursday morning. I was sorting through David's old books, trying to decide which ones I could bear to keep. Emily's name flashed on the screen, the first time she'd called since the will reading. For a second, I thought maybe she'd had a change of heart. Maybe she'd realized how cruel it all was. Mom, she said, her tone polite, businesslike. I think it's time you moved to the cabin. I froze. What do you mean, time? This house is mine now, she said matter-of-factly, as though we were discussing furniture arrangements. Dad wanted you to have the cabin. You'll be better off there. It's quiet, peaceful. You can heal. Emily, I said softly, I've lived here 28 years. Your father and I, this was our home. Just give me until the end of the month, please. There was a pause. I could hear her breathing, steady and detached. You have your own property, Mom. Use it. The line went dead. For a long moment I just sat there, the phone still warm in my hand. The air in the house felt different, thinner somehow, as though the walls themselves were pushing me out. I looked around at the life David and I had built. The worn couch where we'd fallen asleep watching old movies, the framed wedding photo on the mantel, his jacket still hanging by the door. Every corner held a ghost. That evening I began packing. It wasn't anger that guided my hands, it was disbelief, a numb sort of obedience. I folded clothes into boxes, wrapped the dishes in newspaper, took down the curtains. Every sound echoed in the emptying house like a final goodbye. By midnight, I sat on the floor among the boxes, my hands shaking. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The tears felt trapped somewhere deep behind my ribs. At dawn, I loaded what little I could fit into the old pickup, the one David used for fishing trips. The rest I left behind. When I started the engine, it coughed like an old smoker, but it ran. I looked one last time at the house on Oak Avenue. The morning sun touched its windows, making them shimmer like eyes refusing to meet mine. Then I shifted into gear and drove away. The road to Lake Langston wound through long stretches of pine and moss-covered oaks. The radio didn't work, and the silence became a living thing beside me. Every few miles I thought of turning back. But back to what? To a daughter who looked at me like a burden? To a town that would whisper behind my back about poor Helen Carter? The cabin appeared after a long rutted drive, small, weather-beaten, leaning slightly to one side. David had bought it years ago, a weekend getaway we'd never used much. I remembered laughing at how he called it his retirement plan. Now it was all that was left of my life. When I stepped inside, the smell of dust and old wood hit me. There was no electricity, just a dead bulb hanging from the ceiling. The faucet coughed but gave no water. A family of spiders had claimed the corners, and the wind hissed through cracks in the walls. The floor creaked beneath my feet as though protesting my return. I laid an old blanket on the floor and sat down. The boards were cold beneath me. I listened to the wind moving through the trees, the occasional splash from the lake outside, the creak of branches like sighs. For the first time I felt truly alone. Not the quiet kind of loneliness that follows you in a crowd, but the kind that hollows you out from the inside. That night I slept on the floor wrapped in my coat. I dreamed of water leaking through the ceiling, of David standing by the lake calling my name, his face blurred and unreachable. When I woke, my cheeks were wet, though I didn't remember crying. The days that followed blurred together. I cleaned, swept out years of dust, and patched what I could with tape and stubbornness. I boiled lake water to wash, lit candles at night, and cooked canned soup over a camping stove. I learned the sound of loneliness, the sigh of trees, the scratch of a raccoon outside, the whisper of rain on the tin roof. There were moments when I caught myself laughing, small bitter laughs at the absurdity of it all. A week ago I was a wife, a mother, a woman with a name that meant something in Savannah. Now I was a stray, hiding in a cabin with no running water. But in the stillness something else began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but awareness. I realized I could survive the night. And then another. And another. The world hadn't ended, even if it felt that way. One evening I stood on the porch watching the sun sink into the lake. The water turned the color of rust and gold. My reflection wavered there, older, harder, quieter. I whispered to it, "You're still here, Helen." The wind answered with a low hum like agreement. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first week at the cabin I told myself the silence was temporary, that grief had only pressed a pause button on the world. People would call when they knew what to say. People always meant well. They were just clumsy with sorrow. By the second week I stopped telling myself stories. I texted my sister Mara, "Can you talk tonight?" Hours passed. At dusk a single bubble appeared. "Emily said you need time to recover. Rest. I'll check in later." There was a smiley face at the end. A tidy little icon that made me feel like a chore crossed off a list. The calls I made rolled to voicemail. The voicemails I received were measured and brief. Condolences with no return address. One neighbor left a casserole on my porch without knocking. Another sent a card with a poem about seasons. I read it 3 times and couldn't tell you a single line. It felt addressed to a woman who had the luxury of being sentimental. When I drove into town for supplies, the grocery store greeted me with the indifferent chill of fluorescent light. I pushed a wonky-wheeled cart past the apples and the pre-sliced ham and tried to catch Sharon's eye at the bakery. She had sold me every birthday cake Emily ever blew candles over. She was tying a ribbon around a box for someone else, her head bowed, her smile soft. I waited. When she finally looked up, her smile dissolved. She busied herself with a stack of napkins that did not need straightening. "Morning, Sharon," I said. She nodded. "Morning." Her hands kept moving, folding, aligning. I watched her craftsmanship of avoidance. At checkout, the young clerk, new freckled, wearing a name tag that said Haley, asked if I wanted help carrying the bags. I almost cried with gratitude for the ordinary kindness of a stranger who didn't know I was someone to avoid. On the way out, I ran into Pastor John. He used to joke that he could set his watch by seeing David and me in the third pew left side. He shook my hand with an airless politeness, as if testing the temperature of a pool he didn't want to swim in. "We've missed you at service," he said. "I've been at the lake," I answered. "No electricity yet. It's been an adjustment." He nodded, then glanced over my shoulder at something important that wasn't there. "Emily said you're taking some time. Grief is complex." "Is that what Emily said?" I asked. A crease formed between his eyebrows. He recovered with the speed of a man who'd rather bless a situation than enter it. "If you need anything, please call." "I have called," I said, and watched the crease deepen. He touched my elbow lightly, the benediction of a man already walking away. "We're praying for you." The bank was worse. I needed to access the small savings account in my name, money for repairs, for replacing the lockless door. The teller, Claire, asked me to take a seat. 10 minutes later, the branch manager arrived with a smile that was not a smile. "Mrs. Carter," she said carefully, "we've had some concerns. There have been a few unusual withdrawals, right after Mr. Carter's passing." And there's a note on your profile about, well, Emily mentioned you've been under strain. The words hung between us, starched and impersonal. Unusual. Strain. I felt my face go hot. I haven't withdrawn anything unusual, I said. I'm here to move my money, not David's. Of course, she said, hands up, gentling a horse. Protocol. We just want to ensure you're making decisions in your best interest. I am, I said, and wondered when a woman's best interest became something others could notarize. They released the money, but I left feeling stamped, something like fragile or handle with care. Though I knew the real stamp said unstable. The word followed me out, skittering at my heels like a stray dog. At home that night, the lake breathed a film of fog across the porch. I wrapped myself in a sweater and scrolled through messages that weren't there. On social media, my profile felt like a bulletin board no one used anymore. A dozen acquaintances had unfollowed me in the quiet way people let go of obligations. Not with malice, just with efficiency. A mutual friend had posted a photo from a party at the Oak Avenue house, my house. Twinkle lights strewn over the back patio. David and I had poured in one humid summer weekend. Emily was at the center of the frame, glowing glass raised. The caption read, "Fresh starts." A chorus of hearts and glittering emojis trailed underneath. A confetti parade for the sort of beginning that requires someone else's ending. I typed a comment and deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. The discipline of silence is a muscle. Mine was getting stronger. Mara didn't call. When I rang her late one night, she picked up on the fourth try, voice tight. "Helen, it's late." I needed to hear a familiar voice. "Emily says you've been making big changes," she said. "Selling things. Driving to the lake alone. That you're not sleeping." "Emily says a lot," I replied. There was a pause, long enough to hear her doubt assemble itself politely. "I think you should see someone. Just to talk. For perspective." I pictured the neat little folder that had already been built around my name. The therapist would be recommended by someone who'd heard from someone who knew Emily. "I'll think about it," I said, which was both true and a lie. I thought about it and decided I could not sit in a room and be gently led toward a diagnosis when what I needed was a door that locked. The isolation was not loud, not cinematic. It was slow, low-tide erosion. The barista who used to draw leaves in David's cappuccino forgot my order. The dry cleaner mislaid a sweater and didn't call to apologize. On a walk through Forsyth Park, a woman I'd served alongside at the Historical Society lifted a hand to wave, then pretended her phone rang. If neglect had a color, it would have been the gray of the sky the day I signed the grant papers for the museum renovation, work no one now seemed to remember I had done. There were days I considered marching to Oak Avenue and demanding a conversation, a reckoning. But I could see it already. Emily standing in the curated light of that house, face composed, voice low enough to draw the neighbors into our drama without making a scene. She'd say I was tired. That grief had reshaped me into someone fragile. She'd touch my arm in that careful way and steer me back to my truck, and everyone would agree it was for the best. So I did the only thing I could do. I lived. I swept. I scrubbed the mildew from the window frames and sealed the cracks with cheap putty that smelled like vinegar. I installed a latch on the door, then a better one. I taught myself to fix a leaky pipe with a wrench and patience. I boiled water and washed my hair in a metal basin that turned the water the color of weak tea. I slept with a hammer beside the blanket, not in fear so much as in stubbornness. I was not going to be the woman people whispered about. I was going to be the woman who learned to keep warm. At night, I made lists in a small spiral notebook. Call utility company again. Find a used generator. Price of a new well pump? Ask Parker. No, not Parker. Not yet. Sell David's outboard motor? Keep. My handwriting steadied over the weeks, the loops of my less shaky. It felt like proof I still existed. The thin blue veins of ink crossing the page, insisting on the fact of me. Every so often I'd drive the long loop around town, the route my life used to take. The market, the church, the museum, the bench by the river where David and I ate ice cream in July. Sometimes I'd see Emily's face on a billboard for her firm Carter and Haynes. Litigation with clarity. The clarity of a guillotine. I tried to feel anger, but mostly I felt a tired devotion to truth. My daughter had made a choice. I didn't know yet what I would do with that fact, but I held it the way you hold a shard of glass, carefully, with respect for its edges. Late one afternoon, a storm rolled over the lake. Thunder stitched the sky. Rain battered the roof like 1,000 hurried feet. The powerlessness of a house without electricity is a peculiar thing. You learn the shapes of darkness. I sat on the floor with a candle and read the same page of a book 3 times. When the storm passed, the world smelled new. The frogs started their evening choir. The wind grazed the water, and a band of silver lifted from the surface like breath. I realized then that my erasure wasn't complete. The town could forget my name, my number, my place in line. Emily could curate a version of me that suited the architecture of her victory. But the lake remembered. The pines remembered. The hammer by my blanket remembered. And somewhere inside me, a ledger balanced itself. Not with revenge, but with a quiet arithmetic of survival. I was still here. I was not finished. The next morning, as if to test that conviction, a text arrived from an unknown number. Heard you're out at Langston. That place safe for you? No signature. No concern, only curiosity sharpened to a little point. I stared at it until the screen dimmed, then deleted it. The world could keep its questions. I had work to do. I rose, opened the door to the wet bright day, and stepped onto the porch. The boards were slick, the air clean. Far out, a heron lifted and moved across the water with a patience that felt like instruction. I watched it until it disappeared into the trees, then went to find my wrench. Autumn crept in early that year, the air sharp enough to sting my lungs when I stepped outside. The lake, usually calm and glassy, had grown restless, ripples like shivers across its skin. I'd been at the cabin for months by then, long enough for the days to develop a rhythm. Wake with the dawn, boil water for coffee, sweep out the cold, fix what was broken, and try not to think too long about anything. One morning I decided to tackle the shed. It leaned against the slope like an old drunk, half swallowed by vines and the slow appetite of rust. The door resisted my pull, its hinges groaning with age. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of motor oil, mildew, and memory. Boxes sat piled in uneven towers, some marked with David's familiar handwriting, tools, paint, old maps. I started with the shelves, clearing cobwebs, stacking things in some kind of order. Dust clung to my skin, turning the sweat on my arms into mud. Beneath a pile of rotting tarps, I found a small metal box. It was rusted at the edges and heavy, the kind of object that seemed to hold its breath. On the lid, engraved faintly, were the numbers 1954, the year David's father had been born. I turned it over in my hands and noticed something else. A tiny key hanging from a nail on the wall nearby, so rusted it was nearly invisible. Its bow was marked with a small engraving, 12B. When I slipped the key into the box's lock, it turned with a reluctant click. Inside lay a folded piece of oilcloth, protecting a bundle of papers yellowed with time. Beneath them something metallic clinked. A smaller key, heavier, with the same engraving, 12B. I didn't know what to make of it. For weeks I'd lived among practical needs, locks, leaks, wood, food. Secrets felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. Yet my hands trembled as I unwrapped the papers. Most were receipts, land surveys, and letters so faded they were barely legible. But one map caught my eye. A layout of the property, the lake, and a marking near the cabin's foundation. A faint note beside it read, "Access point, keep sealed." I stepped outside and walked to the cabin's rear. The ground dipped there, overgrown with moss and ferns. I knelt, brushing away the damp earth, until my fingers touched something solid, concrete. I cleared more of it, revealing the edge of what looked like a slab about 2 feet across. It had no visible handle, but a small indentation, just wide enough for the key. The idea of opening it scared me. I told myself I'd wait until morning, maybe call someone, though I knew no one would answer. But the air had shifted, thick with curiosity. I fetched a lantern, brushed away the rest of the dirt, and inserted the key. Fit perfectly. With a soft metallic sigh, the lock gave way. The slab lifted slightly when I pulled, revealing a dark mouth of earth and metal beneath the cabin. The smell was old, iron and dust, and something faintly sweet like decaying paper. I held the lantern close and saw the outline of a box inside, bigger than the one from the shed. I hesitated, then reached down and dragged it out. It was heavier than I expected. The hinges were sealed with age, but when I pried them open, I found stacks of folders inside, each stamped with the state seal of Georgia. And on top of them, an envelope with my name written in David's hand. Helen. My breath caught. For months I'd imagined conversations with him, answers to questions I would never ask, apologies he would never give. Now somehow he was speaking again through ink and paper. I sat down right there on the cold ground, lantern flickering beside me, and broke the seal. Inside was a letter neatly folded, the handwriting familiar and steady. The first line read, "If you're reading this, it means things have gone the way I feared they might." I stopped there, my pulse loud in my ears. The rest of the words blurred for a moment as my eyes filled. I wiped them away and read on. "I left Emily what she values most: security, money, approval. I left you what truly matters. The land beneath this cabin holds mineral deposits, long abandoned and overlooked. I never told anyone, not even Emily. I bought the rights quietly years ago in your name. They are yours alone. Keep this secret. When the time is right, use it." The letter went on to explain that under the property stretched a network of old mines, once used for extracting quartz and other minerals in the 1940s. But later surveys, conducted quietly by geologists David had known, showed traces of rare crystals and tourmaline. He'd purchased the mineral rights outright, separate from the property title, and transferred them legally to me. At the bottom of the box I found the proof, official documents notarized with signatures, stamps, and seals. There were also 3 letters from companies offering to buy those rights. The last offer was from 6 months before his death, $9.7 million. I read that number over and over, my mind refusing to process it. For months, I'd thought I was the discarded wife, the woman left behind for sentiment's sake. But this was something else. As the lantern burned low, I sat there in the half-light, the letter trembling in my hands. All the humiliation, the coldness, the whispers, suddenly they shifted shape, as if I'd been looking at the wrong side of a mirror. David hadn't betrayed me. He'd tested me. He had left Emily what was easy and me what was difficult. Outside, the wind rose through the trees, whistling softly, almost like laughter. I gathered the papers, sealed them back into the box, and carried it inside. For the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I felt alive. That night, I slept beside the box, my hand resting on its lid. The lake whispered against the shore, and somewhere deep inside me, something long dormant began to wake. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would find out if this was real. And if it was, then everything was about to change. I woke before sunrise, the lake wrapped in mist so thick it looked like the world had dissolved. My heart was still beating in that strange rhythm from the night before. Disbelief, awe, and something sharp-edged I hadn't felt in years, purpose. The metal box sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it, its cold weight the only proof that what I'd discovered hadn't been a dream. I made coffee on the camping stove, sat down, and read the letter again, slowly this time, tracing every curve of David's handwriting. I left Emily what she values: money. I left you what truly matters. Beneath this land lie mineral deposits. This is your freedom. Tell no one. Use it when you're ready. Freedom. The word pulsed through me like electricity. For months I'd been surviving on routine, my world reduced to firewood, soup, and silence. Now suddenly I had something that could change everything. But with it came a new kind of fear, the fear of hope. I studied the attached documents, land deeds, surveys, legal transfers. David had done everything with his usual meticulous precision. Each page carried his signature and a Georgia state seal. There was even a notarized statement confirming ownership of mineral rights for 240 acres of land surrounding the lake. My name was written clearly in ink. Helen Carter. Sole owner. The offers were equally astonishing. 3 letters from different companies, each neatly folded, each formal and polite. The first 2 were from smaller firms, offering millions I couldn't fully comprehend. But the last, a proposal from a mining corporation in Atlanta, was staggering. $9,700,000 for exclusive extraction rights. I leaned back in my chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. For a long time I just stared at it, waiting for my mind to accept what my eyes already knew. David hadn't left me the cabin as punishment. He'd left it as a key, the kind that only turned if I refused to give up. I thought of Emily then, her calm cruelty, her certainty that she'd won. A small bitter laugh escaped me. If she knew what lay beneath this soil, she'd burn it to the ground. But I wouldn't tell her. Not now. Not ever. I folded the papers carefully and locked them back in the box. Then I wrote a list on a clean sheet of paper. My first real list since the exile began. Verify documents. Find lawyer. Trusted. Discreet. Check land registry. Protect ownership. I underlined the last line twice. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the sky washed clean by last night's rain. The lake shimmered with pale light, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I didn't see a prison. I saw possibility. I drove to town later that day, the metal box wrapped in a blanket beside me. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but instinct told me I needed verification before I allowed myself to believe. I parked near the library and used one of the public computers to search for lawyers specializing in property and mineral rights. The name Thomas Parker caught my eye. A 60-year-old attorney in Athens who had once been a geologist before switching careers. His reviews spoke of honesty, precision, and a habit of doing things quietly. Perfect. I called and scheduled an appointment for the following week. The secretary sounded polite but skeptical when I mentioned mineral rights. She probably thought I was some delusional widow chasing old legends. Maybe I was, but I had proof. The drive back felt different. The trees looked greener, the sky wider. Every mile felt like movement toward something larger than survival. Still, beneath that fragile excitement, there was unease. If David had hidden all of this, from Emily, from everyone, why? And why me? That night I reread his letter again, searching for hidden meaning. There was a line I hadn't paid much attention to before. Tell no one. Use it when you're ready. The phrasing struck me. When you're ready. He'd known I wouldn't be ready right away. He'd known the grief, the isolation, the shame, all of it would come first. He'd built time into the message like a delayed gift. I set the letter down and pressed my hand over it. You knew, I whispered. You always knew. A tear slipped down my cheek, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was something gentler, gratitude maybe, or the quiet astonishment of being seen. For months I'd felt erased. Now I felt remembered. Over the next few days I prepared. I made copies of everything, storing one set in a tin box hidden behind the shed. I even wrapped one copy in plastic and buried it beneath a loose floorboard just in case. I started keeping a notebook again, not of chores but of thoughts, ideas, questions. The town still ignored me, but I no longer minded. When Sharon at the bakery looked away, I smiled to myself. Let them believe what they wanted. Truth had shifted beneath the surface, just like the minerals under this land. On the morning I was set to drive to Athens, I stood by the lake with a mug of coffee, watching the mist rise. The sun was barely up, a pale orange halo behind the trees. I whispered, "All right, David. Let's see what you've done." The truck groaned as I loaded the box onto the passenger seat. It was a long drive, 3 hours of winding roads and small towns, each one fading into the next. But I didn't feel tired. I felt awake in a way I hadn't in years. When I finally pulled into Athens, the air was filled with the hum of traffic and the smell of rain on concrete. Mr. Parker's office sat in an old brick building downtown, its brass sign polished to a quiet glow. I hesitated before going in, part of me afraid that the truth would vanish under the scrutiny of the real world. Inside, the receptionist smiled kindly. "Mrs. Carter? Mr. Parker will see you now." I took a deep breath, clutching the box to my chest. As I stepped through the door to his office, I realized something simple but profound. I was no longer a woman begging for fairness. I was a woman holding evidence. And that, I thought, changes everything. Mr. Parker's office smelled of old paper, coffee, and something faintly metallic. Maybe the residue of the geological maps that covered one wall. He stood when I entered, tall, gray-haired, his suit wrinkled from long hours of sitting. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp behind thin-framed glasses. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "you mentioned on the phone that you believe you own certain mineral rights?" I nodded and placed the metal box on his desk. "I don't just believe it, Mr. Parker. I have proof." He arched a brow, intrigued. "Let's take a look then." For the next hour he examined everything, the deeds, the surveys, the letter. His fingers traced the embossed state seals, his eyes flicking back and forth between signatures. He didn't rush. The room filled with the faint hum of his desk lamp and the occasional creak of his chair as he leaned closer. At one point he murmured, "This handwriting, David Carter, your husband. I remember the name. He worked with the Environmental Bureau in the late 90s, didn't he? Yes, I said, my voice soft. He was always meticulous. He never did anything halfway. Parker nodded slowly. That he didn't. After a while, he pushed back his chair and rubbed his chin. Mrs. Carter, he said finally, I've called the land registry and checked the corresponding parcel number. Your husband filed an independent ownership claim for the subsurface mineral rights. Registered solely under your name. That means they're legally yours. They were never part of your joint marital estate, so they weren't subject to division or inheritance. I blinked, hardly breathing. You're certain? He smiled, a small genuine curve of satisfaction. As certain as I can be without a judge sitting next to me. These papers are airtight. And whoever advised your husband knew exactly what they were doing. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. The room tilted slightly, not from dizziness, but from the sudden realization that I was standing on solid ground again. So, I said carefully, what does that mean for me? For the land? Parker leaned back, lacing his fingers. It means you have something extremely valuable. Tourmaline and amethyst deposits like these, if verified, could be worth anywhere from 10 to 15 million, depending on purity and access. The offers in these letters are serious. I recognize 2 of these companies. But before you sign anything, you'll want an independent geological survey. I can recommend someone trustworthy. I nodded, gripping the arms of the chair to keep my composure. Please. I'd like that. He jotted down a name. Robert Hanley Geotech Consulting. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added quietly, Mrs. Carter, forgive me for saying this, but I suspect your husband knew what he was doing on more than one level. He left you the only asset that required intelligence, patience, and grit to realize. It's poetic in a way. Poetic. The word caught me off guard. I wasn't sure if it was kindness or truth. When I left his office, the sky over Athens was burning with late afternoon light. The streets gleamed after a brief rain, and people hurried past me with umbrellas dripping silver trails. I stood there for a long time, box in hand, watching the reflection of the sun flicker across the wet pavement. For the first time since David's death, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I felt capable. The next few weeks passed like chapters in a book I didn't know I'd been waiting to read. Mr. Hanley, the geologist Parker recommended, arrived at the cabin with a clipboard, a measuring device, and the quiet excitement of someone chasing buried treasure. He spent 2 days taking soil samples, mapping the terrain, and muttering in that half-language of scientists. On the 3rd afternoon, he handed me a folder. Mrs. Carter, he said, I won't bore you with the data, but the assays are solid. You've got high-quality tourmaline and amethyst concentrations here, potentially $11 to $14 million worth, depending on extraction methods. It's an extraordinary find. I stared at him, trying to process the number. Are you absolutely sure? He smiled. Ma'am, I'd stake my reputation on it. After he drove away, I sat on the porch until dusk. The lake glowed in the fading light, and I thought of David again. His quiet intelligence, his steady gaze when he believed in something. You planned this, I whispered. You gave me work instead of wealth. That night I opened a new notebook. Not one for grief or survival, but for plans. I listed numbers, ideas, and steps. I contacted a financial advisor recommended by Parker, a woman named Evelyn Ross who specialized in asset protection and long-term investments. She didn't ask intrusive questions. She treated me like a professional, not a widow chasing luck. Within a month, I had opened a new bank account in my own name. I filed a holding company under the name Langston Minerals LLC. Every decision was quiet, careful, deliberate. I told no one. The town still believed I was fading away in the woods, and that suited me fine. When I returned to Savannah briefly to retrieve a few documents from the courthouse, I drove past Oak Avenue. The shutters were open, the lights on. Emily's car, sleek and new, sat in the driveway. I slowed the truck just long enough to see her through the window, laughing with friends, wine glasses in hand. She looked radiant, and utterly foreign to me. I didn't feel bitterness anymore. Only distance. The kind that comes when 2 lives drift so far apart that language can't bridge the space between them. I pressed my foot to the accelerator and drove on. By winter, I had a small team of consultants reviewing extraction rights and investment options. Evelyn helped me navigate the labyrinth of legal paperwork, and Parker oversaw every document like a patient architect. I learned about royalties, leases, and environmental clauses. I studied, asked questions, filled notebooks with research. It was exhausting but exhilarating. For the first time in decades, I wasn't David's wife or Emily's mother. I was Helen Carter, owner and operator. Sometimes, late at night, I'd walk to the edge of the lake, the stars shimmering above like shards of the crystals buried beneath me. I'd think about the strange symmetry of it all, how loss had forced me to dig deeper than I ever had before, how love could survive in the form of a test. And somewhere in that quiet, I realized something simple and profound. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was becoming. By the time spring rolled around, the air in Savannah carried that heavy sweetness only magnolia trees could give. Perfume and decay inseparable. I hadn't been back in nearly a year, but the town had a way of keeping its secrets and revealing them at the same time. All I had to do was listen. News about Emily reached me slowly, like faint ripples traveling across still water. First came whispers from people who thought I couldn't hear, conversations at the hardware store, murmurs in the post office line. "Did you hear about the Carter girl?" one woman asked another. "That fancy lawyer's having some difficulties." First, I didn't believe it. Emily had always been disciplined, efficient, composed. Her father's sharpness without his warmth. But then a letter arrived from an old acquaintance, a friend from the Historical Society who still didn't quite know whether she pitied me or envied me. Saw Emily at the city gala. She looked thinner. Someone said her firm's in trouble. You didn't hear it from me. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Trouble was a word that could mean anything. But over the next few weeks, the stories became clearer, more pointed. Emily had taken out several personal loans, they said, using the Oak Avenue house as collateral. There was talk of overextension, of bad investments. The kind of language polite society uses instead of saying desperation. I didn't ask for details. The truth always arrives eventually, with or without permission. One humid afternoon in May, I drove into town to meet Parker and sign a few final documents for the mineral sale. The deal had closed quietly, $11. $6 million transferred to an account under my new company's name. Clean, legitimate, final. Parker congratulated me with a restrained smile. "You've done remarkably well, Mrs. Carter," he said. "Most people would have panicked or sold too soon." "I've had practice," I told him, "in losing things." When I left his office, I passed a newspaper stand. Emily's face stared back at me from the business section. Not the polished firm photo, but a candid shot taken as she exited a courthouse, her eyes hollow, her smile brittle. The headline read, "Local attorney under investigation for financial mismanagement." My knees almost gave out. I ducked into a cafe, bought a cup of coffee I didn't want, and sat in the corner reading every word. It wasn't fraud, not yet. But the firm had collapsed under unpaid debts, and Emily's name had appeared in court filings. There was mention of property liens, of a pending foreclosure. $7 million gone in less than 2 years. I pressed the newspaper flat against the table, staring at the photo until my vision blurred. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and inevitability. David had known this would happen. He'd known that giving her ease would undo her. He'd predicted that the same hunger which once made her ambitious would, without restraint, devour her completely. When I drove back to the cabin that evening, the sky was heavy with clouds. I stopped at the lake's edge and watched as a storm rolled over the horizon. Lightning split the sky in two. A bright, violent line between what was and what could be. "David," I whispered, "you were right. But it still hurts." The next few months unfolded like the slow descent of a song you can't stop hearing. Emily's name appeared in local gossip columns, then vanished entirely. I heard through a mutual friend that she'd sold her car, then the furniture, and finally fired her housekeeper. The Oak Avenue mansion grew darker, emptier. Its shutters closed, its garden overrun with weeds. In August, I received a thin envelope from the county office. Public record notice, property lien foreclosure pending, 212 Oak Avenue. I stared at it for a long time. The address that once defined me was now just a line item in a bureaucratic ledger. That night, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, the crickets humming their restless symphony. I thought about Emily, the way she used to braid my hair when she was little, her laughter like silver bells. Somewhere along the way, she'd hardened into someone I didn't recognize. Maybe I had too. Still, I couldn't bring myself to gloat. Revenge had no appeal. The world had already done the work for me. One morning in late September, Parker called. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I thought you might want to know. The Oak Avenue property has officially changed hands. Your daughter lost it in auction." I closed my eyes. "Thank you for telling me. I didn't think you'd want to hear it from anyone else." After we hung up, I walked down to the water. The surface was still a perfect mirror. I saw my reflection there, older, yes, but steadier. There was no satisfaction in Emily's fall, only clarity. The woman who had driven me away was gone, and I was still here. Months later, word reached me again, this time through Mara, my sister, who'd finally started speaking to me after realizing the rumors Emily had spread were hollow. "She's been asking about you," Mara said over the phone. "Sounds like she's struggling. Says she made mistakes." "Mistakes," I echoed. The word felt too small for what had happened. "She might reach out," Mara added gently. "Are you going to pick up if she does?" I didn't answer. Not yet. That night, I lit a candle and unfolded David's letter again. The paper had softened from being handled so often. The ink had faded in places, but one line still stood out clearly. "I left you what truly matters." I finally understood. It wasn't the money or the land or even the secret itself. It was the endurance, the ability to rise quietly while others collapsed under their own weight. The next morning, I put on my coat and drove into town. I passed Oak Avenue without slowing down. The house stood silent, windows boarded, the once white fence leaning with age. For the first time, I didn't feel the sting of loss. I felt mercy. "Everyone gets their reckoning," I said aloud. "Even those we love." The road ahead was long and open, sunlight spilling through the trees like forgiveness. I didn't know when Emily would come back into my life. But I knew when she did, I'd be ready, not as a victim or a rival, but as a woman who had already survived the fire and found gold in the ashes. And that, I thought, was the truest inheritance of all. It was early spring again, 3 years since David's death, when the knock came at the cabin door. I'd been outside tending to the small garden I'd built near the porch, coaxing life out of stubborn earth. The sound startled me. Few people ever came out this far. When I opened the door, Emily was standing there. She looked nothing like the woman who'd told me to leave my own home. Her hair, once glossy and sculpted, hung loose around her face. Her clothes were simple, almost threadbare. The cold had painted her cheeks pink, but there was no fire in her eyes, only exhaustion. "Mom," she said, her voice small. "I owe the bank $560,000. I've tried everything. I don't have anyone else to ask." For a moment, all I heard was the wind in the trees. The part of me that had once been quick to comfort, the mother who rushed to smooth every scrape and soothe every fear, stirred faintly. But the memory of that day on Oak Avenue rose like a tide. "I see," I said quietly. "Come in." She stepped inside, looking around as if the cabin were some relic from another life. Maybe it was. I poured us tea and let her talk. She spoke in bursts about the firm collapsing, the loans, the judgment. About the house she'd lost, the friends who'd vanished. Her hands shook as she spoke. When she finally fell silent, she whispered, "I was so sure I was right, Mom. I thought Dad wanted me to take control, to protect everything. I didn't think I was taking it from you." I studied her for a long time. "You didn't think," I said simply. Tears filled her eyes. "Please. I just need help. Alone maybe. Anything." I let the silence stretch between us, long enough for her to feel its weight. Then I rose, walked to the old desk by the window and took out a folder. Inside were the papers for Langston Minerals LLC, clean, sealed, untouched by the past. "I'll help you," I said. "But not for free." Her head lifted, confusion flickering in her expression. "It's a loan," I continued. $700,000. 10 years. 5% interest. Enough to pay your debts and start again. But there are conditions." She nodded quickly, desperate. "Anything. You'll come here every Saturday," I said. "You'll work repairs, accounts, whatever needs doing. You'll learn what it means to rebuild something from the ground up. And you'll apologize to the family, not in words but in action." Emily's lips parted as if she might protest, but then she only nodded again. "I understand." When she left that day, I wasn't sure she'd come back. But the following Saturday, right on time, I heard her car on the gravel road. She wore old jeans and a faded sweatshirt, her hair pulled back. I handed her a hammer and a list of repairs. The first few weeks were quiet. We barely spoke. She fixed the fence, painted the porch, scrubbed mildew from the walls. Slowly, the silence between us began to soften. We talked, at first about small things. Weather recipes, the stubborn raccoon that kept breaking into the trash bin. Then one afternoon she looked up from sanding a chair and said, "I didn't know Dad left you this." "No one did," I replied. "He wanted it that way." "Did he plan all of this?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "He planned for both of us to learn. You got what was easy. I got what was difficult. He knew which would last." Emily didn't respond. She just nodded, her eyes glistening. Months passed. The cabin transformed, new roof, repaired dock, shelves filled with fresh books and small comforts. Emily stayed longer each time, often bringing groceries or flowers she couldn't really afford. Her laughter, cautious at first, began to sound like the girl I once knew. She repaid the loan early, every cent with interest. When I tried to tell her she didn't need to, she smiled. "I owed you more than money, Mom." One evening, as summer pressed against the horizon, I asked her to come with me on a drive. We headed north through winding Carolina roads, until we reached a hilltop estate overlooking a valley filled with pines. "This is home," I said. Emily's eyes widened. "You bought this?" "With the minerals sale," I said. "David left me the land. I sold it last year." We stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at our hair, the scent of rain and earth heavy in the air. "Dad knew what he was doing," Emily whispered. "Yes," I said. "He left you money. He left me meaning." She turned to me, tears streaking her face. "I'm sorry, Mom. For everything." I reached out and took her hand. "You don't need to say it again. You're already different. That's apology enough." 2 years later, Emily started a foundation in Savannah for families drowning in debt, offering small loans, financial education, and counseling. She called it the Langston Project. When reporters asked about the name, she said simply, "It's where my mother taught me what rebuilding looks like." I keep a photograph on my desk now, Emily standing before the sign, smiling, sunlight on her face. She looks older but lighter. Sometimes I still visit the cabin. It's empty most of the year now, except for the scent of cedar and lake water. When I walk inside, I can still feel David's presence, not like a ghost but like a whisper. "You passed the test." And I smile because I finally understand what he meant. He left me more than land, more than minerals. He left me myself. The woman who once drove away in a rusty truck, broken and humiliated, had found not revenge but peace. And peace, I've learned, is the rarest treasure of all.